Hey, product people, it's Mike with Product Collective, and I am here to welcome you to the end user era. That's the era that we're in. Actually, we've been in it for a while. What is the end user era? Well, a while back, I had a conversation with Blake Bartlett. He's one of the partners at Openview. Openview, they've put out a lot of great content over the last few years about all sorts of things, including product-led growth. And in that conversation with Blake, I'm actually going to highlight a few of the things in this video. But one of the things we talked about was the end user era. And I'm actually going to let Blake tell you all about it right here.
Today, in this environment that we live in today, in 2019, software just kind of ends up showing up inside your company. It shows up unannounced. And the dynamic that we're seeing is that end users are finding these products, any of the products you saw on the prior screen, Slack, Zoom, Dropbox, DocuSign, you name it, and they're telling their boss which ones to buy. So we can call this the end user era. So the end user era is here, and the best SaaS companies, the best software companies that we're all talking about, they recognize it. So here's some quotes from the S1s, the filings before these companies went public. So the most important document of these companies' lives up to that point, describing their businesses. And here's how they describe themselves. So Atlassian says that we recognize that users drive adoption and proliferation of our products. Dropbox says that bottom-up adoption within organizations has been critical to our success as users increasingly choose their own tools at work. And lastly, Zoom says we grow through viral demand driven by individual users. So these guys have figured out that there's something to this end user era.
Okay, this probably rings true for you, right? I mean, think about the software that you're using at your company. Things like Slack, Zoom, Calendly. I mean, there's a million other things, right? But in all of those cases, it probably wasn't some top-down mandate. Everybody here has to use Slack. Everybody has to use Zoom. Maybe that happened, but what happens most of the time with software like that is it starts with an individual or a team just getting started, using the free trial, getting, hey, I'm going to sign up for the up to 5 users plan, and you start to use it. This happens all the time. Actually, for Product Collective and our conference, Industry, the Product Conference, we're in the end user era. Think about it. Actually, most of the people that pay for a ticket to our conference, Industry, the Product Conference, they aren't paying for it themselves. They're using their company credit card. It's a company purchase. But they're asking their boss. They're going to their boss to get permission to come to the conference. It's not as if some company said, they sent some email out and they said, hey, everybody, you all have to go to Industry, the Product Conference. I wish it worked like that. Any companies out there that want to send a mandate out like that, you let me know. I will be on your side about it. But in all seriousness, no, it's from the bottom up. It's an attendee seeing our conference, getting into the idea of coming, being surrounded by their product peers, learning things, getting that inspiration. And again, they sell it up the chain. And that's what's happening with software today. Most of the software that we're using within our companies, it is coming from the bottom up. And that's what Blake Bartlett calls the end user era. We're in this era right now. It's been happening for quite some time, but why? It didn't always used to be like this. What happened to put ourselves in the end user era? I'm going to go back to Blake and then come back to talk about the so what with all of this. What can we do with all of this info? But again, why are we in this end user era? Back to Blake.
Why is this happening? Why is software magically showing up unannounced inside companies? How is Slack growing this way? Why are all these companies that are going public talking about this in their S1 document? What's driving this whole dynamic? Well, I took a step back recently and looked at it, tried to think about it really kind of from a first principles standpoint, and asked myself the question of, okay, if there's this evolution that's happening in the software market that we're seeing, well, what drives evolution in the software market? What are the most important factors that lead to sort of new situations? And I identified 4 different drivers. They're all interconnected, and they all sort of lead us to this point where we're in the end user era. So I'll walk through them, here to start. So initially, it's infrastructure, and it's really the cloud evolution that's happened over the last handful of decades. So back in the 90s, software lived in the data center. We're talking of software living on a physical box inside a physical rack inside a physical data center. And then in the 2000s, we graduate and move into the cloud, where now the software lives in somebody else's data center. It's no longer in the customer's data center, it's in the vendor's data center, and I can log in through a web browser and access it remotely. So I'm no longer buying software myself and maintaining it from a CapEx standpoint through on-prem, perpetual licenses. I'm now renting this software and accessing it remotely, and it's the software company's responsibility to maintain this single code base through single instance, multi-tenant, all that kind of good stuff, and rent it out to me and other customers. And now today, software still lives in the cloud. However, there's an abstraction layer, I think, that's built on top of the cloud, or that's emerged on top of the cloud. So, 2 decades into the cloud era, it is completely different to build software today. Software is increasingly composed, right, rather than written from scratch and written sort of, using vanilla code or something like that. There's APIs, there's services, we have infrastructure as a utility, everything's built on AWS. I mean, the list goes on. So this abstraction layer, it still is the cloud, but it's a completely sort of new evolved version of the cloud that I would call the connected cloud, right? And this leads to an evolution in the cost to build the software and the cost to buy the software, in other words, price as well. So back in the 90s, when we had this physical software on a physical box in a data center, CapEx purchases, you were selling widgets. And it took a long time through waterfall development, years and years oftentimes, to develop new software. And then you were selling them one by one through CapEx purchases. So this means it was super expensive to build the software, and also super expensive to buy the software for the customer. Then in the 2000s, as we moved to rentable software, it's much easier to build and develop and maintain the software because, again, it's that single code base that's maintained for all customers and continually updated. So it makes support, maintenance, adding new features, all that kind of stuff much easier, much more cost efficient. And those savings are passed on to the customer. And they're also passed on to the customer in the form of no longer having CapEx purchases that are super expensive, but now instead having rentable software that's for a fraction of the cost. And so we're moving from a world in the 90s where it was minimum 6 figures, oftentimes 7 figures, maybe even sometimes 8 figures to buy software, to now, in the cloud era, I can get started for 5 figures on an annual basis through a subscription, and it's much more accessible. And then today, because it's so much easier to develop software through all of these APIs and services and building blocks and open source, and the list goes on, and it's also super easy to find this new software. I can go on any app store, any marketplace, the Chrome web store, the list goes on, and one click later, I'm adopting and developing new software. So it's also available to me as an end user that much more easily. And so this has driven the cost to build and the cost to adopt new software down to very, very low levels. And increasingly to adopt new software, it's usually free. We all know this, right? Free trial, freemium, something like that. And this leads to an evolution in the buyer. Who is buying the software? Who's picking and choosing the software for the customer, for the organization? So in the 90s, when it was the data center era, the CIO ruled the roost, right? And her number one concern was IT compatibility. Is this new piece of software going to work in my current environment? And every software purchasing decision, ironically, was a full stack IT purchasing decision. People were making considerations from a hardware standpoint, from a networking standpoint, from a security standpoint, and a software standpoint. And really things had to be homogeneous and work together. And not on that list in particular were the features and the functionality and the design and the product itself. It was really about technology, not product. In the 2000s, we move into a world in which it's no longer about IT compatibility. It's now, because you're not installing anything in the data center, you're renting it. So the software or the buying power and the dynamic shifts from that CIO to the executive who's buying the software for her team, right? So the VP of sales buys the sales software, not the CIO. And the CFO or the VP of finance buys the accounting package or the finance software, not the CIO, right? So it's all now about what are the KPIs that this is going to improve? What's the ROI that this is going to give me? And how is this going to help my team or my organization win in the market, right? It's all ROI oriented. And then in the world of the connected cloud with super cheap and affordable software, this democratizes and decentralizes software purchasing and software budgets all the way down to the end user. And again, buying them and adopting them for free makes it, from a cost standpoint, accessible to do that as well. So as this evolution happens in infrastructure and in price and in cost, we also see a corresponding evolution where buying power and budgets go down the organizational chart from the C level to the VP level, all the way down to individual contributors and end users as this evolution continues apace.
Okay, everything is in the cloud now, right? We don't need to be buying into data centers. Make software cheaper. Software's getting cheaper for not just that reason, but a lot of other things are playing into it. Just the cost of software driving down and down and down in terms of our ability to build it. And now the software purchasing decisions have become democratized because it's cheaper, because we can buy the software very fast and we could start using it right away. End users are making those decisions. End users have the ability within the company to maybe just take their credit card and try something out, buy something and use it, get value out of it, and then sell it up within the organization. That's why we're here today. But so what? What can we do because of all of this, right? Okay, the end user era is here. If we are all the ones as individuals within our companies making decisions, at least having an impact on making those decisions to bring software in, now we as product people, we are the ones who are building the software. What can we do about it, or what should we do about it? Well, I'm going to give you 4 actionable takeaways that, because all of this is true, we as product people should be keeping in mind. And I'm going to encourage everybody to take action on these things. The first is focus on solving end user pain points, right? It used to be that we'd build this software so that that CIO at the very top, we're answering all of those questions, and eventually that CEO would be looking at all the check boxes that we're able to check off with the software, and hopefully he or she would make the decision to buy the software for the entire organization. That's changed. Now it's really important for us to solve those end user pain points, those annoyances. Blake Bartlett calls them annoyances, and I think that's so true. Those users, those end users, they are annoyed in their everyday working life with certain pain points. And if we can solve those annoyances, that will really, really stand out. The other is delivering value before they ever even reach the paywall. This is a big one. In this end user era, it's so important for people to get value out of something and see that value before they've spent the dollar. Again, us at Product Collective, industry, the product conference, we try to do this, right? Our product is our conference. That's what we sell. But how do we deliver value on a conference before somebody hits the paywall, before they buy a ticket? Videos like this, right? I hope you're finding this valuable. I hope you find our newsletter valuable, our podcast, all of those things. They don't cost a dime to you, but you're getting value out of what you might expect from our conference, Industry, the Product Conference. And in the software we're creating, we can do that in a number of ways. Content's one of them, but we can actually get people to try out the product itself and experience it without ever paying for it. I shouldn't say without ever paying for it. Eventually, they will pay for it. We want them to pay for it, but they don't need to pay for it at first to get that value. The next is remove friction from the user experience. Make it easy for users to get started with your product. If you are building ways for them to get value before they ever even reach the paywall, make it easy for them to get to that point, right? You could go ahead and do that, but if it's so hard to get to that point, people can't ever even experience that value that you're making available. So we need to find all of the friction points in our product. Everything, if you were to say, hey, this is the point where people start getting value. They're not paying for it quite yet, but this is where they could get the value. Here's where they start. They start by just landing on our website. Look at all the friction points that might be everything in between and ask yourself how you can remove those friction points. And the last thing that I would implore everybody to do is to rethink your sales approach. This does not mean you shouldn't have salespeople. You don't need a sales process. Just your product will sell itself. It's PLG, baby. That's what it is. That's not product-led growth. I mean, yes, letting your product be a sales driver, maybe even the primary sales driver, that is what product-led growth is all about. But it doesn't mean that you don't necessarily need salespeople. But what it might mean is that your team is going to focus on product adoption. Maybe one of those key KPIs that you're looking at is product adoption. Getting that end user to get to the point where they're first experiencing that value. Maybe that's a key KPI instead of number of sales calls, right? Now, again, I want you to have your sales team in place. You probably have a great sales process. That's beautiful, right? But product-led growth is about augmenting that, maybe even coming up with an entirely different strategy beyond that, so that you can deliver value to your users and let those users enjoy your product, experience your product, get to the point where they're paying for your product. That's what product-led growth is all about. So I hope you enjoyed listening to some of these points. It was an awesome conversation with Blake Bartlett. We have the full video in our member hub for Product Collective. You can check that out. But I wanted to zoom in on these specific points to get us thinking about how we can get our companies to basically embrace this end user era and be a part of it. All right. I will see you again at the next video I create here. Have a good one.